everybody to another edition of Faith Greater Than Fear. And I'm Mike here in Joplin, Missouri with GNPI, Good News Productions International. And we have, since the beginning of this unusual season called the global pandemic, done and used technology to just bring to the forefront people of faith who love Jesus and are doing just normal things, life on life things, and in some cases, extraordinary things. And that describes my friend and guest today, Chris Galanos. Chris, welcome.
Mike, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Tell our viewers a little bit about Chris Galanos, the man he was and his family, and where you're from there in Texas. And then we'll get into part B of just what God has put you on a trajectory to doing. So welcome.
Sure. So again, my name is Chris Galanos. I was born and raised in Lubbock, Texas. We live in Dallas, Texas now. So Lubbock, Texas, for those of you that may not know, is about 5 hours west of the DFW Metroplex. And Mike, I married my wife, Emily, when just out of college. We met at Texas Tech in Lubbock. She also came to Tech. And we have two daughters. One is 13. The other is 11. So we're having a lot of fun with them, both girls. And and so our first part of our ministry was in Lubbock. And then now in recent months, the Lord has sent us here to work in Dallas-Fort Worth.
So prepared for ministry, tell our audience what it is, Chris, that you used to do when you were in Lubbock. And God did some great things in that part of the ministry. Unpack that for us.
So after college, I went to Texas Tech. I was a computer science major there. I was in the IT world since God calling us to ministry. So we went to Fort Worth and went to Southwestern Seminary, graduated from Southwestern, Mike, and then we moved back to my hometown feeling like God was leading us to plant a church there. Surprising kind of to everybody, including us, because there's a lot of churches in Lubbock, but felt like God was calling us back and to start a church that would aim toward reaching those that were unchurched. I started the church, Mike, in 2007. And it grew very rapidly. And by our 10-year anniversary, at our 10-year anniversary, we met in where Texas Tech used to play basketball in the Coliseum. And we had 10 campuses that most of them were able to join us that day. And we saw God do amazing things. Our vision, Mike, of prayer really at the very beginning with 12 of us in the living room when we were starting this church was, Lord, would you allow us to lead 10,000 people to faith in Christ in 10 years? None of us believed that was probably possible, but we were just with as much faith as we could muster praying that the Lord would allow us to see something like that. And so, Mike, there in the Coliseum at our 10-year anniversary, we celebrated just over 13,000 people that had indicated they were committing their life to Christ, and just over 6,000 people that we were able to baptize during those 10 years.
I hope you find folks at home are listening and hearing what God is alive and well and doing some fabulous things. But as Paul Harvey, I'm dating myself, says, now hear the rest of the story. So you see this fulfilled beyond your wildest dreams, 10 campuses, 13,000, 10 years. Then what does God do with Chris's heart?
Well, Mike, in year 8, we passed that 10,000 mark because we were over 13,000 by the 10 years. So in year 8, we passed it 10,000. And Mike, we started praying a dangerous prayer. And I tell people, don't pray this prayer. Unless you're willing to give up everything you have to follow Jesus and do what he says, don't pray this prayer. But the prayer, Mike, essentially was, Lord, you told us to pray for 10,000 in the first 10 years. What do you want us to pray about in the next 10 years? What's the prayer you want us to pray? Not what prayer can we make up to pray. Lord, what's on your heart? What do you want us to pray for in the next 10? And Mike, at the Coliseum, the 10-year anniversary, we got up and we shared with the church what we felt like the Lord was leading us to pray in the next 10. And we sensed he was wanting us to pray, not for another 10,000 in 10 years, but for 1 million in the next 10 years. And so you can imagine the Coliseum, everybody's like, is that possible? How are we going to fit 1 million people in the building? I mean, can we fit 1 million? So I'm sure people were just going, what in the world? But Mike, that led us back to basically the drawing board. And, shortly before we made this announcement, we put 1 million at the top of the whiteboard in the conference room with our leadership team in there. And we just said, if the Lord's given us this prayer, this 1 million in 10 years, how are we going to do that? Mike, it didn't take us but about 30 seconds to recognize we can't keep doing what we've been doing if we want to reach 1 million in the next 10 years. Nothing wrong with what we've been doing, but what we've been doing, Mike, was addition. We were adding people to the kingdom, which was great. We knew that with 1 million on the whiteboard, we knew that to see 1 million in the next 10 years, if that's the prayer God had led us to pray, Mike, we would have to see the multiplication of disciples and churches. It
And
would
that's
have to
your passion
multiply.
now.
Yes, it would have to multiply away from us, Mike, rather than adding to us. And so at the tenure, we said, hey, here's how we're going to get there. DMM, disciple making movements, multiplying disciples in churches to the fourth generation and beyond. And so we were encouraging our church to get excited about joining us.
So unpack the code. It's short DMM. I know a lot of our audience is not going to be aware of that. Tell us what that is and why it grabbed your heart.
Yes. So DMM stands for disciple making movements. I didn't know what it was either. But when the Lord gave us the vision for 1 million in the next 10 years, Mike, at the same time, we were being exposed to what God was doing around the world, where millions of people were coming to know and follow Jesus in these movements, they called them. And as we began to learn more about them, we learned that this rapid multiplication of disciples in churches overseas was being called DMM. So that's how we were introduced to the term disciple making movements, which really describes a process of making disciples and planning churches generationally that you're hoping leads to movement stage, which is multiple streams to the fourth generation and beyond. So when you think DMM, just think about generational or multiplicative disciple making, not making disciples all at one generation, but making disciples that make disciples that make disciples that make disciples. It's a process for moving toward that result.
I'm a son of a farmer, and so basically what we're talking about is not trying to work at this element of addition and filling buildings and calling people to us. And one generation, as you say, because in the farming sector and planting, if you have a hybrid, it is terminal. You can plant it that year and it will produce that year, then it dies and it does no more. That's not what you're after. In multiplication, you have a kind that will then, its seed will be able to reproduce more seed, and again to, like you say, the fourth generation. So what did this learning and what God is doing outside our U.S. territory touch your heart? What did it cause you to do of this mega church with 10 sites and this vision for 1 million people?
Yeah. So we had that on the whiteboard, the million, and then the leadership team, Mike, agreed if God's really given us this vision or this prayer for 1 million, we have to change strategies. And DMM was the only one we knew that could get us to 1 million. Mike, not because it was theoretical, but because in practice it was reaching millions overseas. And again, just describing taking the Great Commission seriously and multiplying disciples in churches. So we got up that day and just said, hey, God's given us this vision for 1 million. And we said, that means some things are going to have to change. And I think at the 10-year anniversary, Mike, everybody's excited, but we recognized that over time, as we began to roll this out, and that the cost was going to be that everybody in the chairs sitting and usually just enjoying the services was going to have to become a disciple maker. And ultimately, as a natural result, a church planner, because when you make disciples, Jesus plants the church, so we're indirectly church planners. Mike, that gets scary, because a lot of people love just going to church and enjoying great church services. Not everybody's ready to go make disciples of all nations, And so we shared it with the church. We said, this is the direction we're going. And we had many people say, yes, this is awesome, and join us. And we had many people decide that for the next 10 years, the Lord was going to move them on to a different church. It would be more like a traditional church where they could just enjoy church on Sunday morning rather than really being a part of a mission where every single person would have to be involved and would have to be a disciple maker.
As a result, there was a disengaging from one strategy and an engaging to a new strategy. What were some of the costs and changes? So you were in Lubbock. What did that happen to you, your job, your ministry definition, the buildings, and where you're on to now? Yeah.
So what seems to be a cost, or what looks from the outside as a cost, ends up in many cases being a blessing, because we just knew that even if the money or the giving would go down, and it did, or the attendance would go down, and it did, we knew that the Lord would give us the amount of money and the right amount of people to do what he had called us to do, much like with Gideon, the story of Gideon. And he had all the folks, and then the Lord kind of narrowed it down. So we just knew as people, Mike left because they were saying, hey, that's a great vision. That's just not for me and my family. Mike, we weren't trying to convince or persuade anybody. We just encouraged him to do, whatever the Lord told him to do. And if they wanted to go to another great church, we blessed them and sent them and said, the Lord be with you. And so I would say from the outside, obviously a cost of this is we projected, Mike, that we would have an attendance decline, which we did. and that we would also have, the giving go down, which it definitely did. But Mike, we were prepared for that. And we knew, here's what's great about movements. It doesn't take 5,000 people like we had on a weekend to reach 1 million. In fact, in movements with multiplication, the saying often goes, a team of 2 to 3 can reach 100,000. That blew our minds. A team of 2 to 3 can reach 100,000 with a multiplication methodology. So Mike, that told us 10 teams of 2 to 3 can reach 1 million. So he knew, just like Jesus knew with his 12 disciples, Jesus didn't have to have the crowds of thousands to get his mission accomplished, right? 12 guys and 11 guys could get the job done, And so we started to recognize that it only takes a few to reach millions with a multiplication strategy. And so we just knew that, regardless of how many people left or stayed, the Lord would give us, the number we needed to move forward. And so, Mike, at our 10-year anniversary, what was great is we had already trained a group of people, and that we laid hands on and sent out to plant some of these churches at our 10-year. So we realized that at our 10-year, Mike, we already had enough people engaged to accomplish the mission God had given us if he were to blow wind into our sails.
That's awesome. And you've written this journey down. Tell us, what's the name of the book?
Yeah. So Mike, we wrote a book called From Megachurch to Multiplication, which is kind of our way of saying from addition to multiplication. A megachurch is usually an addition model. From megachurch to multiplication. And Mike, the reason we wrote the book is for people in our church and pastors in our city to not think we were totally crazy, that we had thought through some of this. But Mike, evidently somehow it got outside of Lubbock, and so many other people have read it as well. But the intention of the book was just to give some explanation for why we would do this.
And so a megachurch pastor like yourself, a former computer science major,
yes,
now is starting to work both as, if I remember, at Starbucks, you and some others, and then you were in real estate and selling and so forth. What are you doing now? So you've moved to Dallas, and what are you doing now?
Yeah. So Mike, we had many folks on staff, and many of the staff decided to stay with us and even get jobs and become bivocational to be a part of this with us. Some staff decided to move on as well. Either way was okay with us, whatever the Lord wanted. But Mike, we and I write about it in the book. We really wanted to, by becoming bivocational, even though some of us could have been paid, by becoming bivocational, we were basically saying to the people that we were talking to, hey, you don't have to be full-time in ministry to be a disciple maker and church planner. And Mike, I think until we became bivocational, people could easily say that. Well, it's easy for you to say, Chris, you make disciples and plant churches. You're paid full-time to do it. So Mike, we really sensed, let's not be paid full-time to do this, and let's keep doing it so that nobody can say, hey, you got to be paid full-time, that anybody can do this. Anybody, any ordinary person with a job, businessman, woman can do this. So yes, Mike, I started a real estate company, and that eventually allowed us to completely come off the payroll at the church. This is about a year and a half ago. And and some of our other staff have done similar things. And then as a result of that, now that I'm not speaking on weekends, because now we're meeting in many different gatherings, not just one building where I'm speaking. We sold our main building, Mike. We kept a facility where we still meet together on occasion, but weekly we meet in homes across our city. And now, Mike, the network of churches is in 12 states and 5 countries. So it's moved around very quickly. But we, at our church, Mike, we've had a heart for Thailand. We've been sending folks long-term to go to Thailand. And so since I wasn't speaking each weekend, my wife and I have had a heart for a while to work among Thai people. And so we asked our church that met in a home, our DMM church, as well as the elders at eLife, if they would send us to work with a major Thai population in DFW. And they sensed the Lord was leading us in the same way that we felt we were being led. And so they have blessed us and sent us here because, Mike, so much of our training and coaching I do online anyways. So I'm still helping to oversee the network of churches in West Texas and now across the country and in multiple countries, while living in an area where we can engage regularly with many more Thai people. So that's kind of part of our vision as a church.
From 10 places and the mother building, whatever, to say again to our audience, how big is the network that's been reconfigured? So
78 churches now, 12 states, at least in 5 countries.
Wow. God is doing something. And it sounds to me like in your expertise and experience, along with others that you have worked with, do you see the trajectory coming to where in the next 10 years you can reach 1 million people?
So great question, Mike. So I told our churches, our network of churches, through a blog post when we moved here, that I felt like what we had seen in the last couple of years, if it continued to multiply, if we continue, we call it, we use the sailboat analogy, Mike, if we continue to raise sails for movement, that if the wind of the Spirit blew into these raised sails, there was no doubt in my mind that we could see 1 million in the next 10. Mike, whether we will or not is up to the Lord.
Sure.
In our minds, we've got the sails up. So to me, I think we're doing the things that we can control, namely getting the sails up. And then we're praying for what we can't, namely the wind of the Spirit to blow into those sails. So Mike, we're beginning to see, as you can tell by our network now, some multiplication. I think we were thinking the 1 million would be in West Texas. And now we're realizing maybe if we reach 1 million, it could be from all over. So that's changing some. But yeah, I have no doubt if the Lord comes and blows wind into our sails that could happen.
As I listen to you, Chris, I think it's in John 6 where Jesus has done some fabulous miracle in feeding, and then changes the narrative to talk about, unless you are part of me, you will not have any part in what I'm doing in the kingdom building ethos. And most of the people leave, to the point that from thousands who followed, it was down to Jesus turning around saying, "Now, are you going to be with me too?" And later on, when he was on the cross and coming back, he didn't come back to crowds. He came back to just one less than 12. And then out of that, then some others in that upper room. But it spread after that from the few who really got it to the multiplying. And so I appreciate that heart of passion and a boldness and going back to the biblical narrative. And I think for the time we have left, tell me how you feel as a man of God in what God is taking you through, very unique in our culture, how where you're at today may be totally in line with what the pandemic is kind of torquing and causing on our culture and the church in the model you used to be in, and why and how we're feeling that torque, and how you think, I think, you're ahead of the curve and the Spirit has already put wind in your sails for such a time as this. Is that making sense, those questions?
Let me answer in a couple of ways. First, I will say this, and this is not to say that we've done everything right or anything, but after the pandemic hit and even people that didn't want to really do church in homes were moved to homes, I'll say a number of people that ended up leaving our church messaged me and just asked this question: "How did you know?" And I don't know if the Lord had us do this before the pandemic for some reason, but it's caused enough people to go, it's caused enough people to feel like our move maybe 6 months prior to the pandemic was somewhat prophetic. You know what I mean? I don't know if it was or not, but enough people have gone, that's really interesting, the timing of that. Mega church to multiplication, it all happens before all of us are forced into homes. I mean, how does that work? So I would say in one sense, at least from our network's perspective, Mike, we were very prepared for this, because as we entered in the pandemic and I was working with pastors, I mean, people were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. And Mike, I would tell them all the time, it is largely unaffected. We've largely been unaffected by it, just because of the way we're choosing to meet, right? To where it's not huge gatherings that we need to shut down, and now we need to stream a sermon on church online. Nothing wrong with those things, Mike, but we were just not doing those things anymore. And so, Mike, I would say the result of the pandemic with many pastors around the country is I've met with many of them. We've had little conferences and meetups online, people saying, "Hey, would you tell us?" They're more open to what we've been doing as a result of the pandemic. And they're saying, "Hey, would you tell us a little bit more?" And so, Mike, we've had the chance to, as has Francis Chan, because people have looked to some of what he's done and asked him questions, because he was a little bit ahead of this as well. But just people just beginning to think about church differently, Mike, and recognizing, when they go back to what they perceive maybe as normal after this pandemic, it's going to be a new normal. It's not going to be exactly the same. And Barna's released some studies that are, troubling in terms of a decline in church attendance and decline in church online. And I know a lot of pastors that I've talked to are, having to take pay cuts, and there's a reduction in giving. They're just trying to figure out, Mike, what it's going to look like. So what I think is one way I think the Lord is using this pandemic in a very helpful way to churches is causing pastors and church leaders to get down on their knees and say, "Lord, what do you want us to do?" This has for sure changed our world, and it's changed the church. Maybe in some ways, Mike, they would hoped it wouldn't, but it has. And Lord, what do you want us to do? What I tell pastors all the time, Mike, is don't do what we've done. Don't do what Francis Chan's done. Revelation 2:3 says this. Jesus speaking to the churches. One thing he said, same thing to all seven. At the end, he said, if you have ears to hear, hear what the Spirit is saying to your church. And so, Mike, we tell pastors all the time, don't just do something somebody else is doing. Do the hard work with your elders of getting down on your knees and fasting and praying and say, Lord, we have ears to hear. What are you wanting to say to our church in the midst of this pandemic? Are we doing what you want us to do? Are we accomplishing the mission you've given us? Or would you redirect us during this pandemic into, doing maybe certain things in a different way, or Mike, focusing in ways we haven't been focusing? Mike, I think that's the win from the pandemic with pastors, is if they'll use this time of, one guy the other day, Mike told me that his church has been obliterated by COVID. That's the word he used. And I was just like, wow. I mean, and he meant that nobody's coming back. 75% of his people haven't come back. The giving's way down. I mean, it's causing him to go to his knees and say, Lord, what do you want us to do? And he just started a DMM training with us. So, Mike, I think the pandemic is doing things like that in the hearts of pastors. And I think even if they keep doing the things they were doing before, it'll be a healthy process of them just making sure they're doing what the Lord wants them to do.
Great word to that sector of our population. In the minutes we have left, what would you say to the family, the working man and his wife, 2 and 3 kids, who do have a feeling and uneasiness? Where should they go to find more about DMM and or about this simple church and just being a disciple who not only can convert someone to Jesus, but can inculcate in them the ability to multiply? That new convert can be a disciple who is also able to multiply. Where should they go?
Mike, so I'd say the first thing, and I really mean this, is they should open up the New Testament and just ask the Lord to give them just fresh eyes to see, to not read it through the lens of their denominational background, to not read it through the lens of how they like church to be or how they grew up, but Mike, to read the New Testament, especially like the book of Acts, and just ask as you're reading it, could this happen again in our day? Could God do this? And I think they'll come to the belief, yes, God could. And then I think the question, Mike, will be, how can I be a part of it? And they'll see in Acts 4, John and Peter, unschooled, ordinary men. But Mike, they had been with Jesus. And what does it say later? They couldn't stop speaking about what they had seen and heard. Mike, if any ordinary person wants to be a part of a movement, they just need to be set so on fire for God that, like John and Peter, even if they're unschooled and ordinary, they can't stop speaking about what they've seen and heard. And if all the people in the pews, Mike, not just the ones on stage, but the people in the pews will get fired up, they would ask the Lord to help them repent of all lukewarmness in their life, and they'd be set on fire for Jesus and wouldn't be able to stop speaking about what they've seen and heard. We'd see miraculous movements of God break out all across this world. We need Mike, it's not just, talk to the pastors. We need the pastors to catch this vision so that they can empower the ordinary people to go out and make disciples and plant churches. Unless, Mike, ordinary people are making disciples and planting churches, we're not going to see movements. And one last thing from India that's so great is if you go to India and some of these movements, Mike, you'll ask somebody, hey, what do you do for a living? And the ordinary people, and they'll say, I'm a taxi driver, but I'm actually a church planner. I'm a teacher, but I'm actually a church planner. I'm a doctor. I'm actually a church planner. Mike, the ordinary people own the mission, and they see themselves as church planners. In America and anybody else and anywhere in the world that's watching this, we've got to come to a point where we go, it's not just the pastors that are supposed to obey the Great Commission. God can use us to make disciples. And when you make disciples and they gather together in groups as they're saved and baptized, Jesus plants churches. And so indirectly, you're a church planner.
Wow. Chris Galanos, thank you for your story. Thank you for your mission, and thank you for your passion for Jesus and love for him. It's very, very obvious. And isn't it true that when you go to the New Testament, you see that Jesus didn't call the Levites or the elite, and the priests, he called the fisherman, the businessman, Amen, to be those that would do this unheralded work of starting the kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. Chris Galanos, thank you. For all of you, thank you so much for listening to Chris Galanos today. He's called out a book that gives a little bit of the story, and there's other things that we're going to put in writing there. And so we thank you. We hope it has blessed you in these 25 minutes together and just will put your heart on fire. We know you're a person of faith. Don't fear this pandemic. Jesus is doing some great things with his Spirit. Let the wind, as Chris said, to hit your sail in your life. You can do more than you think you can, and during such a time as this. So if you have enjoyed it, share it on your social media channels, because probably somebody else out there would enjoy it as well and be touched by it. We have a podcast as well that can bless in that regard. So until next time, thank you, Chris Galanos, for joining us on this edition of Faith, Much Greater Than Fear. God bless you.